Okay, here's the Oliver number 9. His typewriter was made in 1917. It was about $50 by Craigslist. It's mechanically otherwise in pretty good condition considering its age. The biggest thing is, unfortunately, it was dropped on its head, and so some type bars are bent. That will definitely need some work there to get those all lined up, and I don't think it's a showstopper. The other big thing is kind of common with these typewriters is the drawstring. There's a spring in here, and the drawstring pulls the carriage back, and that drawstring, of course, is long gone. And unfortunately, there's a really nifty hook that was designed to capture on the carriage when you put the carriage in, and then it would hook onto it, kind of a parking hook on the body of the machine. You could take the whole carriage out. Unfortunately, that's missing. It's a fairly minor thing to make. It would have been nice to have had, but no big deal. The spring is broken, so I got to figure out how to fix the spring. I've seen a couple of YouTube videos so far, instances of how to do it, and I don't think it's a problem. It's a really neat design that it tries to maximize the most out of the resources. It only has 3 key rows instead of the typical 4, and so each key has its own extra function, and in order to access that function you shift the carriage one way or you shift the carriage the other way. It seems like a little sticky. I thought it was traveling a little nicer than earlier. Maybe it's I've had the carriage out. Maybe you don't have something quite right. It's not quite as nice now. Mechanically everything otherwise seems to work actually not too bad, at least from an initial go through. I mean, I don't see huge showstoppers. Some of this stuff is probably because you just don't have the spring loading of the carriage for those other motions. Things like back thing has a little stick. It obviously needs a cleaning. Everything needs cleaning, I'm sure, and oiling. It's not. I've seen pictures on the internet of these guys in way worse shape. One thing I'd like to do is learn nickel plating, so I'm thinking of nickel plating those guys. It's kind of a scale of ideas I would like to try to do with this guy. I'd like to do the initial just cleaning, explore the machine. The mechanics is one of the things that kind of fascinates me. So mechanically it's a really neat machine, and it's at a kind of a pivotal time in mechanical history of things really starting to take off. And it's amazing is the guy that designed this was a reverend in some I guess church or whatever in Canada, and he designed this initial design, the Oliver 1, and then they went through quite a few Oliver iterations. Basically the basic concept improved and more features added over time, up until the time of the Great Depression that took them down. And of course by then really a more modern typewriter design had come along. This was an early, you come up with interesting ideas for ways of doing things that when you first have a birth of a technology, and you'll have odd little dead-end routes and so forth. And this is, basically kind of one of those dead-end routes. It had its own little niche market for a while there. I guess it was good for stencils and so forth. So they kind of hobbled along for a while there with stencils and other stuff, because the strikers can generate a little more force, I guess. And it was probably a lower price than some of the more, quote, conventional typewriters of the time, and what became ultimately the standard up until they become electric typewriters, and then ultimately, of course, computers. So it's nice to explore an early technological route and how they went about trying to get the most out of the technology of the time, because this thing was an expensive thing, and making anything out of metal even back then was a premium. This was a premium piece of machinery, because most everything else was still made out of wood or minimalist materials. So this was very high tech in the day, and just manufacturing something was very challenging. And machine tools only really came to their own to any really decent degree up about less than 100 years before this thing was made. So by the time this thing was made, you could make things like this without so much difficulty, but obviously nothing compared to what you could do today with computer-controlled machine tools. And that's kind of where I'd like to take this. I'd like to play around with it as is. Once I get far enough on that, I'd like to take it apart and render it all in CAD And I know that's quite a challenge. I don't know if I really realistically do that. It's kind of one of those 10% to 90% project things where you start on a thing and you realize it's not that interesting and it dies out at about 10%. And the more elaborate projects, you might get 90% done, and then that last 10% is such it gets to be a drag, and you don't get that finished either. So I'm probably talking a whole bunch of, over optimism. But it would be neat to take it completely down to the last bit almost, and render it in CAD, because I have to admit I do like doing CAD. And then you can model it in CAD and have a nice CAD simulation and so forth. But most of all, you could, make replacement parts. You could use this as a assembly maintenance rebuilding resource for the community, because I can't find anything on the internet at all for this guy. I mean, there's how to use the typewriter, a little manual that would have gone for the secretary or what have you to have used, and that's about it. There doesn't seem to be any documents that have survived in the way of how you take this thing apart and fix it or do anything. Not that there's really that much to it. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious. Machine, for the most part, it's not really that complicated, but it'd be nice for people that are finding these guys and restoring them to have the resource, and it'd be a fun project for me to do. It's actually not that complicated. I was about ready to start working on a totally mechanical, fully automatic calculating machine, and that's quite a different kettle of fish. Now that's a complicated machine. This looks complicated from the first of it, but it's really just the same bits repeated over and over and over again, with relatively few other key pieces that tie everything together. And it's not really that bad. It's amazing how simple the solutions were. It's really kind of elegant. And then the next thought is, okay, we could take this guy into the computer age, and I could get probably about 30 solenoids, make a base plate that this guy would just sit on, not alter the machine at all, and just have solenoids activate all the keys, and basically computerize it, and then have some micro switches to indicate the keys that are being pressed. So you could either use it as a computer keyboard, or you could use it as a really funky computer printer. And then I suppose I could go even one more crazy step further and kind of make it into a classic teletype machine, and either find some surplus paper tape reader and punching machine and tie it all together that way. It'd be fun. As a kid, I'd run across this kind of a IBM Selectric that this company had modified with a teletype or a punch reader and writer, but the machine never worked right, and I could never get it to work right. It had a huge amount of relays in it. It'd be kind of neat to kind of recreate that. I also saw some YouTube videos where this one guy, Curious Mark, rebuilt a teletype machine. It's just incredible, elaborate, wonderful piece of technology. And considering it used a motor and one solenoid, that's otherwise it's completely mechanical. This, obviously, I'd use a whole bunch of solenoids, and I'd be cheating with some computers and so forth. But it'd be a fun project, just for the heck of it. I guess some people might call that steampunk. I don't know. It's just something to kind of breathe life into this thing. I'm not a typist myself. I mean, I'm kind of illiterate and can't spell very well and all that stuff. So the word processor saves my life. But so I wouldn't actually use this thing for any practical purposes, and I'm not sure why anyone would anymore today. I know there's a few die-hard typewriter people out there. They probably grew up with these, or they're just really good at that stuff, and they don't have to have the helper stuff that the weaker people like me, when it comes to literacy, has to deal with. But physical, three-dimensional mechanical stuff, I basically have a CAD computer running in my head all the time, so seeing this stuff in 3 dimensions isn't really too big a deal, and it's a lot of fun. And like I say, it's neat to look at somebody's old take on things. So anyhow, there is the Oliver typewriter.